Welcome to the Inside Housing Podcast, where we break down the housing process, real estate, and investing. Here we go. Chris, appreciate you joining me. How you doing?
Rennick, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. This is a great space you created.
Pretty excited to have you on. Senator Chris Mattos representing...
I represent the towns of Milton, Westford, Fairfax, and a part of Essex Town in the state senate.
Okay. You're down in the state senate. Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got there? How long have you been serving in the legislature?
Yeah, it was the late summer, early fall of 2017. The former representative, Ron Hubert, in Milton, resigned from his seat, and I was just working one of former realtor broker here, Don Turner. I've worked with him for a long time. He was a huge impact on my life, big mentor of mine. And we were sitting around, and I ended up asking him, how do you get that spot? Because it's vacant right now. And I had to go through the process, go to the town committee. Names get put forward to the governor, and the governor chose me in the fall of 2017 to represent Milton in the House at that time.
Don was such a huge figure. I know he knew Jack really well, and I never had the opportunity to meet him, but every single time his name has come up, it's just been, that's how you represent people. Was he a bit like your mentor?
100%. I was never in the real estate political realm at all, and then it was probably back in 2006 where I got to know him and ended up working for his father doing excavation. At that time, I was in college. I wanted to be a CPA. And it was after the first semester.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Two different ends of the spectrum there, working in the dirt and then working at a desk. And it was after my first semester that I realized I don't really want to be a CPA anymore. I finished up college, ended up working for his father the whole entire time, weekends, nights, during the summer. It got me to fast forward to 2017. I was still around and never thought once I'd get into government, but what I looked at is there's a lot of older people in the legislature, and I look around at all the kids I went to high school with, all my good friends. They all moved away, and I thought I should probably try and keep them here, and what better way than get involved in the community and state level to try and impact change to allow younger Vermonters to stay here.
That's actually one of the things that I want to talk about, and it's on my mind a lot, is we're losing people in Vermont. I think the last stat that came out, and I'm actually Kevin Chu from the Vermont Action Plan. He's actually coming on at the end of the month. And I want to dive into really why and what can we do about it, because it's hard to see so many young people not want to stay here when there's lots of beautiful place. You saw that early on and made you get into the legislature. How's that going?
It's going. It's a struggle every day that I go down to Montpelier. Just so everybody knows, it's a citizen legislature. So we're there beginning of January till about mid to late May. And we work on trying to make Vermont the space where everyone can stay, everyone wants to come to, everyone wants to live in. Everyone has a different opinion on how to get there. From my point of view, I'm a young family. My wife and I live in Milton. We have 2 young boys. And there's not a lot of folks my age that stayed around. And it's a few different things. There's good jobs, but there's nowhere to live. When I got started in real estate, it was 2016. Don also got me into that. And I've been working with Jack for the past 10 years now. It's been quite a while. So back then, one of the first home sales I did was up in Highgate, new construction. Nice ranch, 1-car garage. Sold for $189,000.
I hope you bought 10 of them.
So the folks I helped out get into that house have some pretty good equity in that house by now.
Yep, they do.
Those are unheard of now.
It blows my mind. That one, like under 200,000, you can't find that anymore. No. And I don't know if we're ever going to go back. And it's like fundamentally changed, to me, like the landscape, right? Where that same ranch, probably somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000. Interest rates are higher than they were at that time, because I think 2017, 18, they were hovering around the...
Probably right around 4 at that time.
4 or 5%. Right. Yeah. So the math was different. So we know that's a huge impact. What is, from your perspective, now that you're in the legislature, does everyone understand that?
I don't think everyone does, because we talk so much about affordable housing, which is subsidized by state money. A lot of that comes through in nonprofit work. And you hear a lot about opening up 50, 60, 70, 100 units of condo-style, apartment-style housing. But what we forget is there's state and federal money behind that. So a lot of these units are costing anywhere from $500,000 per unit to
Really?
construct. And in the private sector, working with Don over all the years, he was a real estate developer, and I got into that, and I learned a lot about what it costs and what you can sell it for. And a private developer can do it a lot cheaper, more affordable than that, but they can't access those funds more often than not. So the state of Vermont over the past few years has done different things with the CHIP program, community and housing infrastructure program, which I was actually a part of the conference committee on. Okay. So in the legislature, when the House and the Senate don't agree on the bill, there's a committee of conference put together where it's 3 folks from the House, 3 senators. They sit down in a room and they hash out the details that both can agree on, and then it's voted on by each chamber. And we passed that last year. It was actually a $2 billion housing program where using the increment in tax savings, so you freeze the tax base on the property, you build up the infrastructure, you build the housing, and you get to retain that increment to be able to pay down the debt that you took out for the infrastructure. Because in building, you have to put several hundred, if not millions of dollars into the infrastructure before you can even put a house.
Why, with that program though, are we only building quote unquote affordable housing?
There is an aspect to it that it has to be affordable, but depending on what level of increment you want to retain, that will dictate how much you have to have as quote unquote affordable. But other than that, you can create market rate, single family, multifamily dwellings.
Why are we not doing more of that? Because, so when I think of like affordable housing, I'm not necessarily thinking of subsidized housing. I'm thinking of your first time home buyer trying to get into a 2 or 3 bedroom single family home and start their life. To me, that's affordable housing. So are those two words mixed up? Is that not, because the affordability crisis it's on the news, it's on the radio, it's talked about all the time. It's not really subsidized housing.
It's the nature of the landscape in Vermont where for a builder, private builder, developer to be able to create housing, it can't get to be that affordability because of the cost of the land, the cost of the permitting, the cost of construction itself puts it at a level that you need more than what the government says is affordable wages. It's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. We in the legislature have done things over the years to try to ease Act 250 restrictions. One of the big things that we're talking about now is one that was actually passed 2 years ago. It was Act 181. That has some interim exemptions to allow for more building and create map areas that actually accelerate that process. But some unintended consequences of that is areas that are more rural, it's restricting their ability. And we've heard a lot about that recently, and the Senate has addressed some of those concerns with S325 that we passed last week.
Let's break that down a little bit. So Act 250 was originally passed as a way to control growth or sort of expand on it?
Act 250 was passed in 1970 as kind of a mechanism to control where growth happens and go through the process. And more detailed than that, it was more aimed at like commercial growth, about where we wanted commercial growth to happen
in Vermont.
In Vermont.
All right.
And that expanded out over the years, and it really brings into housing developments. And we've seen that a lot. If you notice driving around Vermont, that there's a lot of 9-unit subdivisions, because once you hit the 10th one, it triggers Act 250. And that is what created the sprawl that we have, because you weren't able to grow in those compact areas, and it sprawled out more.
And then bring in Act 181 a couple years ago. What was the intent of that?
181 was to identify those areas that should be used for growth. So we're thinking about your downtown and village centers. Chittenden County is a great example. And then also having an area where they wanted to conserve land and make it more of the wildlife refuge spaces where it won't be as developed if you did go through an Act 250 process. And that is actually turning out to be probably the biggest issue about Act 181. There is no map that is set in stone yet, so the process is still ongoing. S325 that the Senate passed last week actually pushes those dates out another couple of years.
So changes to those dates?
So we slowed the timeline down. So instead of coming in at FY 2028, they're coming in 2030. There's more time to get public input. And one of the biggest things that I learned that you can get, it's a whirlwind in Montpelier, and you can think everyone knows what's going on in Montpelier because you're there every day.
Everyone thinks they do.
But no one really knows what we're doing down there. So there was a big outcry of rural Vermont that's saying, hey, you and the legislature are really screwing up what we got going on out here. And I, for one, definitely heard that. And way back in 2024, when I was in the House, I didn't even vote for Act 181. There's a lot of good things in it, but I couldn't support it because of the rural aspect of it and how much restriction there was. Because if we're in Montpelier doing something that affects the value of your land, you should know about it. And we shouldn't just assume that you know about it. So we need to, over the next 4 years, make sure the public's involved, folks that will be affected by these changes, they know what's happening and have their input be heard by us in the legislature. We're moving towards that. I think S325 is going to do a good job of having more outreach. It's definitely spurred a lot of folks right now. There was a rally at Montpelier last week. Hundreds of people came out, and it was good because I was able to talk with some folks in the crowd and really hear what happens on the ground to these folks that live where this would be affected.
That's good. That's good that gets pushed out a little bit. So if we zoom out for a second, right, we know housing is deeply affecting everyone in Vermont. We know that costs have gone up. And some of these things I don't think can change. Post-COVID and that inflation, I think Vermont had 70% inflation in prices. However, nationally, inflation was anywhere between 40 and 50, 60% anyway. So it's like a nationwide issue. Zooming out in Vermont, though, how can we right the ship? Because those smaller legislative wins or losses, they make a difference here and there. But what would we need to do, just in your opinion, to turn this into a developmentally friendly area where developers, people want to move and come in and develop? And I know that's a big question.
That's a huge question.
No, but I'm curious because you're also, because you're down in Montpelier and you understand how the legislature works, what would you do if you could just...
As I spoke about earlier, everyone wants the best for Vermont. Everyone wants Vermont to be affordable. We just have different opinions on how to get there. One example is a few years ago we passed a child care bill. And child care is very expensive in Vermont. And what this bill did basically was raised $100 million to help increase the payments to child care facilities that receive CCFAP funding, Child Care Family Assistance Program. And it also increased the allowable income limit. So if you're a family of 4, for instance, you can be part of this program if you make up to, I believe it's $183,000 household income, family of 4. But I didn't vote for this bill either. And it was a tough vote for me because A, I have young kids. B, I'm the chair of the board of directors of the Milton Family Community Center, which has a child care program. And we would see as a center increases in our rates from the state, but what it did was raise those rates 35% January 1. And this was a couple years ago. January 1st, rates went up 35%. But what they didn't take into account that to live in Chittenden County, to afford the median household value, purchase a home in Chittenden County, you would have to make more money than CCFAP went to. So being able to afford a house in Chittenden County automatically puts you out of being part of this program. What that did was you're thinking about, if you're buying a house at that level, you're going to be spending about $4,000 a month on your mortgage. And then childcare, because I'm there for 2 kids, it's It's about $37,000 a year. So that's another $3,000 a month. And then your
So
gas, your groceries, your utilities, all these things add up. And it starts in Montpelier where we think it's a great program, which it is. It helped a lot of people. It brought more people into the program, but it is a cost of $100 million to all of Vermont on your payroll tax. And it put those folks that are living in Chittenden County, median household income 183,
Yep.
puts them out of the program, and their costs went up 35%. So it's things like that add up over time, where we think we are expanding a program to encompass more people, but at what cost?
I think the other thing that's interesting you said when you added up your $3,000 or $4,000 mortgage, your $3,500 for childcare, just gas and a couple utilities, you're at close to $8,000 a month. And at $8,000 a month, you do the math, that's $100,000 a year. I remember when I thought making $100,000 a year, I was gonna be balling, right? Lamborghinis, all of it. Now you're just like, I'm barely getting by.
$100,000 used to be when you made it.
It was.
When you're making six figures, you made it. Now you're in Chittenden County. I know you're scraping by if you're trying to get into our housing and be able to have a car and pay for everything like that. And that's Vermont, though. We have a very dynamic state where we have pockets. We have Chittenden County that has about 140,000 residents. The state of Vermont's only 640,000, and it's our economic hub of the state. Then we have places like the Northeast Kingdom, down in southern Vermont, where those home prices aren't what they are here. The jobs aren't what they are here. And Vermont's very different depending on where you are. What corner of the state you're in is very different. Yeah. And I see that even real estate-wise, helping folks out. I try to stay closer to home, northwestern Vermont, but it'll take me down into Williamstown. I got asked to go over to Island Pond. That was a little far from me, so I didn't head over there. But still, looking at the prices and things like that, one size doesn't fit all in the legislature, but we always try to make it. And that's also part of the problem, where a blanket policy does not work throughout the state.
What are some of the... So we're halfway through the session, right? This is... What do they call that pause in between?
Right now, we're just getting past crossover, where bills go from one body to the other, and that's when...
Is it vice versa? Can they go from House to Senate or Senate to House, or is it always House to Senate?
Nope. So the Senate and the House each work on bills for the first half, and then they switch over. Whatever gets passed goes over to the other body. And those are pretty much the topics that are in play, because you can't introduce new legislation after crossover. A little inside baseball, you can put them on what we call vehicles, which is bills that come over. You can put on different policies onto vehicles. For instance, in Senate Finance last year, we started with a unpaid caregiver tax credit. That bill, after going to the House, coming back to the Senate, actually ended up as the military retirement exemption. It had Social Security on it. It had different tax policies. Didn't even have the unpaid caregiver tax on it. So the bill started as something, ended completely differently. So that's what the crossover is. This is when, over the next couple of weeks, it'll be a little bit of a slower time in Montpelier. A lot of committee work being done, but then the last 4 to 6 weeks of the session is going to be fast-paced.
What are the bigger things that need to happen near the end of the session? I know the governor has in mind talking about the education reform, which has a direct impact on housing. What are some of the other ones?
So from my perspective, I think the number one thing we have to do is education reform, because when you think about our education fund, when I got started in the legislature, my first session was 2018. And I was put on the education committee in the House. Education fund at that point was $1.6 billion. Fast forward, now 9 years later, it is now about $2.6 billion. And so each year on average that I've been there, it goes up by about $100 million spending. Each year our student population declines by 1%. There's a little bit of a mismatch there in our school spending, and what Act 73 of last year passed is going to implement a foundation formula which will tie your local spending directly to how many children you're serving in your district. And I've talked to a lot of school board members, and I always ask them, do you want to spend your time on crafting a budget that can be passed locally? I come from a town, Milton, that rarely passes a budget the first go around, school budget. Rarely passes. And we're below the state average in spending. But it's the mechanism of the current funding formula where all the money goes into one pot,
And then
gets
gets
redistributed, and what happens is lower spenders effectively subsidize higher spenders, and lower spenders fiscally responsible with their money, and they don't want to spend more than they have to, and they want to provide a good education, but that tax rate supports the whole state, therefore their taxes get brought up. What Act 73 would do is take away that budget burden, if you will, of the school board and be able to distribute funds based on the children that are in your school. And you can, as a school board, as a school administrator, you can focus on providing the best outcomes for students, which I think is what a lot of Vermonters want. Test scores, middle of the road test scores in Vermont with one of the highest per pupil costs.
So I got thoughts on that. I actually serve on a school board. I chair my school board. And you're absolutely right. We're in one of the lower spending districts. Yeah. We've been pretty fortunate because our standing is actually quite high. So I think we're like 13th or something in the state with less and with budgets that struggle to pass sometimes because of the mismatch between, hey, we have a low budget, but there's still an impacts on taxes, and it's not always understood that goes to the state. Yeah. So I'm hopeful that Act 73 goes through. Small nugget for you. I recently found out that the narrative that comes out that Vermont is one of the lower test scores, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's not equal. So if another state is at 50% and we're at 50%, that could actually be very different results because Vermont elects to have a higher standard than other states do. I'll give you an example. So if Mississippi said, to be proficient and meet proficiency, that's a 30%. Vermont could say it's 70%. So the proportion of students that meet one benchmark versus the other can be different because Vermont makes it higher. So I found that interesting. It doesn't always equate to what with the actual results in the kids in the school because they're coming out and they're actually doing pretty good.
I understand that, and I know some of the results that we've seen are just the standardized tests across the state. One, and I think the tests are the same. They're standardized.
There's some nuance there. But it does bring back the point that ultimately we want as good test results as we can. And then when you're getting into some of the bigger things, it's the burden on the taxpayer. So Act 73 is, you think it's going to make it through?
That's a huge question. That's a huge question mark right now in the legislature because there was a committee put together last year to draw maps for these districts. And step 1 is drawing maps. Step 2 is for the foundation formula to come into effect. If step 1 doesn't happen, step 2 can't go forward. From everything I'm hearing, there's the House version and there's the Senate version of what's going on.
So we have 2 different maps right now?
2 different versions. Okay. One's not even a district map. It's a total other concept. Seesaws, which you've probably heard. Cooperative Education Service Agreements, I believe they're called. I think it's funny because probably 3 years ago the legislature passed BOCES, which is the same exact thing, just different letters. But they're saying it's something new, something innovative. But what that is allows school districts to work together more collaboratively, to share resources. A lot of what we hear now is, I only need a 0.3 of this position, but I can't hire a 0.3 because no one will do it, so I have to do a whole 1.0 FTE.
Okay.
And that's what drives up costs, because if you don't need a person all week, but you have to pay them all week so you can actually hire them, that just compounds on your spending. And as healthcare costs are very high, but I would push back on that a little bit because...
On the healthcare piece?
No, it's very high, but that's not our whole reason why spending goes up $100 million every year. And when you look at our student-staff ratio, one of the highest in the country, I think Maine beats us. And we had Joint Fiscal Office come in and give a presentation on if we went from 2 to 3 on our student staffing ratio, from the second highest to third highest, we'd save about $52 million a year. So it's things like that, right-sizing the ship. I'm a firm believer on, you always hear from the field that people are getting out of the field, they're going to different areas. Superintendent's Association says they have a 25% turnover rate year after year. Right-sizing our staffing just with attrition. If you lose 2 people, really do an analysis to see, do you need those 2 positions still in your budget? because our student to teacher ratio is actually quite good.
Yeah.
We're pretty on par with where our legislation has been in the past, where national averages are. We're pretty on par. It's just there's a lot of other adults that are in the school. And what we're finding is, and this happens a lot in the legislature, is we feel like the more money we put into something, the better the result is going to be. But that's really not the case. And to bring it back to real estate, we could do things in Vermont to ease the restrictions on building that doesn't cost a single dollar, and we can create more housing. And that's Act 181. A lot of bad in the bill with rural Vermont. But locally, in areas where we want growth, there's actually Tier 1A and Tier 1B, and that will provide a pathway around Act 250. If you're a Tier 1A area, you can create up to 75 units, and if you're Tier 1B, you can create up to 50 units of housing, and you go right around Act 250.
Act 250 comes up a lot. Why not just do away with it? Because if the ability to, because the permitting and the expense for that, like it seems to take away from the desire to build affordably. So is there ever talk of maybe just doing away with it and just starting with something else that keeps, because there's good parts of it, right? We do want some regulation. We want to keep some of the things that keep environment good in Vermont. Is there ever talks of maybe doing something like that? I know that's big and it's probably unlikely.
Yeah, and a lot of the talks always come back to just making tweaks here and there. And this is what Act 181 started on. This is what S25 is pushing those dates out. There hasn't been a lot of talk about just totally repealing Act 250 because it does take into account. We don't want to make Vermont something that it isn't and just have building wherever we are. We already have half our towns in the state don't even have local zoning. That's another hurdle. I enjoy that fact because it allows folks to do what they want with their land, and then that Act 250 backstop where if they want to build a 300,000 square foot warehouse in the middle of a farm field, that's not really what Vermont wants. And Act 250 being a backstop there, I think is necessary. What I think Act 250 restricts is the building in areas where we want. You look at South Burlington, you look at Milton, you look at Colchester, and not just Chittenden County. You have Newport City, you have Brattleboro. The areas where you want to concentrate housing, it's still very difficult to build just because of that Act 250. Yeah. And Act 181 allows more of that building.
The other thing, too, is that a lot of people, when they think of Vermont, they think of your ranch off with a couple acres in the woods, privacy. That's what you think of. So to be able to not easily grow in those areas probably also, it hurts. Now that you've seen that and you touched on it before, what is it like when you first got into the legislature? What are some of the things that you've been both surprised by but also impressed by in terms of what it's like to have that? Because to me, it's the citizen legislator is a difficult thing because you still have to work and support yourself. So what are some of the things that you've taken away so far that you've been there a few years now?
Probably one of the biggest things, your first year, and I think this happens to a lot of legislators, you run, you get elected, you ran on all these ideas that you pitched to the folks that elected you, and you get down to Montpelier and you're still gung-ho, ready to go. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change the world. And then government moves really slowly. And you introduce a bill, whatever topic it may be, and then all of a sudden, doesn't get talked about, doesn't get touched. Media doesn't talk about it. Committee of jurisdiction doesn't talk about it. You talk to folks, it's a good idea. It doesn't go anywhere. What I learned is power in the legislature really moves legislation. So when you
What do you mean by power?
So when you think about the Speaker of the House, the pro tem of the Senate, they're the leaders of each body. What happens there is they steer the ship where it's going to go. If there's an idea that they're on board with, ship's going to head that way. If there's an idea they're not, ship's really not going to go that way. So from my point of view, when you work, it's all about relationship building.
Sounds a lot like real estate.
Over my 9 years, and which is why I like everything that I do is always dealing with people. Whether it's real estate, whether it's my property management and excavation, or being in Montpelier, it's always dealing with people in the public. I guess I really enjoy that because everything I do has to deal with it. But it's building those relationships and getting your ideas across the finish line. And it's not about getting some big idea past the finish line, and not to keep going back to Act 181 and S325, but there was a small change that needed to be needed in S325. There's an interim exemption right now for these Tier 1A and Tier 1B areas where they can bypass Act 250. Okay. And one of the things in Tier 1B, which is where we want development, if the parcel of land was over 10 acres, you still had to go through Act 250. And in Vermont, we don't have perfectly flat, square, 10-acre lots. Anyway, and so what happens is still in some of these communities, there's parcels of land that are 15, 20, 25 acres in size, but there might be a cliff face. There might be a low-lying area that might be a wetland or a sensitive area. So you can only put 30 units, but it's on a 25-acre parcel, and you're automatically kicked out, and you have to go to Act 250. So I had an amendment that actually made the finish line, actually passed on S325 to eliminate that restriction for the next 4 years. If you're in a Tier 1B area and you have any size parcel, you can create up to 50 units on that and bypass Act 250. So it's those small things
That's actually not small.
that actually make pretty big impact.
That's a pretty big deal. And you introduced that bill?
I introduced the amendment, talked to some local developers that actually have real on-the-ground experience with it and how it would help. And creating, I'm talking about Essex, Jericho, right here in Chittenden County to be able to get those housing. And that's not to say Fairfax is going to be a Tier 1B area. They have some public water, public sewer infrastructure. In a Tier 1B in Fairfax, we have parcels up there over 10 acres. What the drawback would be is if you had currently, if this amendment didn't pass, if you had 3 15-acre parcels side by side, each of those would trigger Act 250 if you wanted to build over 10 units. By doing this, instead of taking away 45 acres of land to build 9 units on each, which would give you 27 units, you could now take one of those 15-acre parcels, build those 27 units, never have to go through Act 250. And that leaves open another 30 acres of land, in this example, that could be used for future development, stay as open space, so it restricts that sprawl that everybody talks about, sprawling out, and it makes it more densely populated. And that also drives down the cost because there's really no money in building a road. You just have to build a road to get to the houses that you want to build. And that all funnels into the price of the home when you go to buy it. So if you can save on infrastructure costs, save on engineering costs, that's all going to be passed on to the end consumer, the home.
That actually decreases the cost, therefore you can get a more affordable home that we're looking for.
Because right now, if you're a developer, the cost of land acquisition is so high that they can't afford to build affordable housing.
The other thing, too, when you buy land, it's usually financed differently. So it's harder to, if you acquire a couple acres and it used to cost you 10, 20,000, you would fund that differently than when you go to actually finance a home. Now that the lots itself are in the hundreds of thousands, just coming up with it makes different calculation for builders. That should be on the news.
I wish it was, but I haven't heard too much about it. But I'm hoping the developers and folks that really build the housing in Vermont are paying attention to that and know that it's going to make it easier to build those units because we want to grow in areas that we need housing. Chittenden County is one of those. Newport City, Brattleboro, all those hubs need to have housing, and it needs to be affordable and not just be able to say it's affordable because it's subsidized, but that it's constructed in a way that a developer's not going to want to build something that loses money, but they can do it at a price that's affordable for folks to get into.
It's also aiming for that sweet spot. And that sweet spot, your first-time home buyer, like let's say they got good jobs they can afford between $300 and $400, maybe $450, and they want a nice house, a little bit of land. Like that starts you off on a whole different footing. I used a story. There was a house in Milton, and it was a nice home and like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, quarter-acre lot. 13 offers on it within 2 days, because that's what people want. Not to say that getting a condo in Burlington is not great. That's for some people, but I think you got to have that right balance. So that amendment that you put onto S25, 325,
S325, yep.
onto 181, that's going over from the Senate to the House now, or from the Houses?
Yep, so that'll go from the Senate over to the House. House will do everything the Senate did. It'll go through the committee process,
Okay.
and then onto the floor. That's not to say that won't change. It gets it out there. We had other amendments brought to the floor that would eliminate Tier 3 areas. That didn't pass. We had amendment on the floor that would pause Tier 3 even longer. Didn't pass. These little things that we do to make the bill better is going to allow the conversation to continue. In the Senate, if it was brought up that Tier 3 want to wipe it away, maybe that can continue in the House, and they can have better luck over there. All to say, I can't speak for the House. They'll do what they will with the bill. Us in the Senate, we usually say the House screws up our bills, but I'd imagine
They probably say vice versa.
I'd imagine
so.
the House says the same about us. But just those little things, because during COVID, that was brutal, working with first-time home buyers. And my heart went out to the folks they had their pre-approval, they were ready to buy.
Yeah.
And we go into a house, and then I have to make the phone call later on, a few days later, that, hey, you got beat out by a cash offer, 50, 100 grand over. And if we have housing stock in Vermont that is in that $300,000 to $400,000 range, and there's an abundance of it, that'll create some supply for the demand that we have pent up.
So, because of school board stuff I was doing, we had a school board and legislators got together, and we were talking about the districts, all that. And one of the things, as we're talking about affordability, is I said, it isn't even so much like a education issue, it's a housing issue. Because if we had more housing, we'd have more people. And if we had more people, that in a sense would help everything. So I really hope that stuff passes.
And it's like Governor Scott says, we don't need more taxes, we need more taxpayers. And like we see in Milton, we're 7th or 8th largest town in the state. Very large community, and we have a lot of building going on. Single-family homes, multi-family homes. And what I'm seeing every time I meet with the superintendent, I ask, what are our student enrollments looking like? Ironically enough, pretty flat. We'll go up by 5, we'll go down by 5, but we're pretty flat, right around 1,500 kids in Milton. But we have so much housing that's being built, but there's no more kids coming into the school system. And I often wonder, and it goes back to the affordability that we talked about before, and why I got involved in the legislature in the very beginning, is that a lot of young people are just leaving the state. And what that takes is not just the new younger workforce, but also young families. And my wife and I, we had kids later. We had kids in our early 30s. And after get careers established and then have children. And by that time, we've already lost these Vermonters that maybe have been here and left, or Vermonters that never even made it here. Because, like we talked about, there's no housing. There might be a job for me, but I can't find a place to live. And in the legislature, we need to know that fact, that if we don't make this place somewhere that kids can grow up in, families can afford to stay in, and I'm a firm believer on, once you get to retirement, you shouldn't have to leave to go protect your retirement in Florida, Tennessee, wherever. It's full circle. And I've introduced bills. Big in Vermont is a lot of the older generation loves going to casinos. There's bus trips that go to Akwesasne out of Milton. There's people that go down to Connecticut, Massachusetts, over to New Hampshire, over to New York. So in an effort to help offset some revenue in the education fund, I introduced a bill that would allow the siting of 2 casinos in the state of Vermont. And the proceeds from those casinos would go towards directly the education fund. Because we talk about the lottery already goes there. A lot of people say the lottery is a whole bunch of money, but what a lot of people forget is that it's only the profit that the state makes on the lottery. So it's about $35 million annually that the profits go into the education fund. We got to remember that $35 million on $2.5 billion is not a lot of money.
Yep.
But every little bit counts, because every dollar that goes into the education fund, whether it's sales tax, rooms and meals tax, purchase and use tax, lottery funds, helps bring down property tax. By coming up with different ways that's not a tax, it's allowing for an industry to set up in Vermont that would flow revenue into the fund by giving people the choice to go there as a casino. That would help lower property taxes. Instead of, we hear a lot about raising taxes on the wealthy, or we actually raised, a couple years ago, the legislature raised the property transfer tax. It was pretty substantial. It's 3.62%, I think, if that's the right number that ended up passing. But it's just those costs that add up. Instead of trying to find ways of getting new revenue to the state, it's always about raising
It's
revenue.
so interesting you bring that up, because especially from running a business, and you run a business too, expenses is just one half of the equation. Like, revenue is the other half. So, like, finding other ways, and revenue is not necessarily in just taxes. There's other ways too. So, yeah, I hope you keep pushing those kind of ideas, because that would be great to see.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, government moves slowly. I've been talking about education reform for the past 9 years, and it was probably 9 more before that, and 9 more before that. Change is hard, and as in school districts, change is very hard. And we in the legislature, to our own fault as well, is we pass a lot of bills that can never be fully implemented at the district level. So we never really see the savings that are intended, because we're already changing our mind. I think about Act 173, the special education reform, where it was supposed to allow districts to have more flexibility in the delivery of their services while bringing down costs. And some districts fully onboarded those. They're seeing those savings. Other districts halfway. Other districts haven't implemented it at all. So it's not having the same savings that we were intending. And then we make another change. And we're going to talk about Act 73 in this point, where we're just going to change the funding system altogether. I made a joke in committee that I feel like I might have been here too long, where legislation that I was initially part of is already being talked about scrapped. That was 8-9 years ago this passed, and now we're talking about getting rid of it in this new education funding world. So it's hard on school districts, totally get that. It's going to be a lot of change for a lot of folks, but at the end of the day, I just want to provide the best outcomes for our students, and also make it affordable, because if people can't afford their taxes after they even pay their house off, that's not a good thing.
I think the one thing about Vermonters in general, though, is that we're pretty tough.
Yeah.
And everyone wants the best. And despite things we can disagree on, I think there usually is like a pretty good true north, which is we want to help each other, we want to support kids, we want the best outcomes, we want affordability. Seems like you're doing a lot of good things, Chris. So I really appreciate the fight that you're doing down there.
We try to, and I'm hopeful that we can make some good progress this year with both the Act 181 and also the Act 73, which has to do with the education finance that we touched upon a bit, and just make it easier for folks that want to come here, be able to afford to, and the folks that are already here, be able to stay.
The last question I got for you is, how do you find that balance to do everything you're doing? You're down there in Montpelier. It's not easy. Right, it's not easy to go down and, you said, have this expectation that I can change everything, but when you're part of a system, it's hard, it's complicated, the ship moves slowly. Your father, your family man, like, you have a business. How do you balance that all?
It's difficult. Probably a better person to answer this, probably my wife, but it's just having that team behind me that starts at home. My wife has always been very forgiving on when she gets a text from me that says I'm on my way home. It really means I'll see you in about an hour or two. And the good thing about the legislature is it's usually January to May, most amount of time. It's this time of the year that is really a crunch on me, because the dirt work's starting to get going. Housing market's starting to move quite a bit more after the winter lull. So these next couple of months for me especially are a bit more difficult, but just having that time available. Mondays, we're not in the legislature, so I get a lot of work done on Mondays. And having a very caring and thoughtful wife at home that allows me to go to different meetings throughout the week, and being in Montpelier is probably the biggest help. But just having a good team around me that allows me to be able to do the different things that I do is the biggest support that I could have.
Good. I'm glad to hear, and I just want to say I appreciate you for coming in and what you do, and good luck as we move through crossover, and hope some of the things that you're putting forth come to pass.
Yeah. Thanks,
So,
Rennick. Thanks for
Thanks for
having
being
me.
on the show.
Absolutely.